All right, while you guys are filing back in, I'm just going to read you some information about our next speaker, which is Stephen Andrasko. Are you guys familiar with Stephen Andrasko at all? Yep, there's a few of you out there. Yes, that's so great. He is a Texas UFO researcher. He's going to talk about UFO sightings in the 1800s as featured in the recent book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, UFO Encounters of the Old West. He assisted with the research in that. When Steven Spielberg put out the movie Cowboys and Aliens in 2011, many people wondered if UFOs were really ever seen by the cowboys and ranchers of the Old West, and the answer is a resounding yes, according to Steven, who will present a number of tales and encounters between real cowboys and UFOs. He lives in McAllen, and he's spoken at a number of UFO conferences. There's a whole list of them up here. Just know it's a lot. He's done a lot of speaking and a lot of research. Very well respected in our community. He holds a master's degree in library science from the University of North Texas, and he's currently co-authoring a book with Noe Torres regarding a famous UFO incident from the 70s. If you guys will please give a warm welcome to Stephen Andrasko.
Okay, good afternoon. Hope everybody's been having a good time and having fun listening to our speakers. I'm usually speaking to elementary school kids, so talking to adults is a little bit different. So if I look at you as maybe kindergartners or something, I might feel a little more comfortable and less nervous. Well, you got to hear about the crash that happened here in Aurora. That's why we're all here. But there are other stories that were recorded in the newspapers of small towns in the 1800s. Stories of unidentified objects, spacecraft, or arrow-like vehicles as described in these newspapers by the people of the times. Since there were no airplanes at that time, it's kind of hard for when people would see things, they would describe them in terms that they understood and they knew. So we're going to look at some of the stories that are presented in this book by Noe. And Noe's right here. He'll be speaking a little bit later. Okay. Which way do I point, Noe?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Okay, so Hollywood has its versions of what happened in the Old West, okay? But newspaper stories have accounts of the real cowboys and aliens, and we'll take a look at some of those. Well, we'll start in 1864 in the Rocky Mountains. There was a fur trapper and hunter. His name was James Lumley, and he was out one night when he saw a bright object that streaked across the sky. It was followed by a loud explosion, and the ground shook, and a strong wind about knocked him off his feet. So the next morning, he decided to go and investigate. Okay, this happened at the Cadott Pass in Montana, up in the mountains of this area. I don't know if any of you have been up that way. But what was strange, when he saw the object, it had knocked over trees, a long path of destruction, and when he approached the object, it looked like a huge stone had crashed into the earth. It was blackened on the outside. But as he got closer, he discovered that there were compartments inside this stone. So at first he thought it was some type of meteorite or meteor. As he went inside, he saw that the walls were inscribed with what he described as hieroglyphic type writings. And so the newspapers at the time published his story, and the people that interviewed him said he was so sincere they had to believe that it was true. Now what's interesting is in the newspaper article, it talks about how in the future aliens may travel across space in meteors, and that they might land on this planet like Columbus did in the ancient days, and that we would end up suffering the servitude of like the Native Americans did at the time, to the new race of people that would come to Earth. So it's kind of interesting how the newspaper account took his story. Now, we'll jump ahead about 10 years and we'll go to the town of Fort Scott, Kansas. This is a little different. In the evening one night, right after dark, there were some farmers out and they noticed a very unusual happening in the sky. What they described as a serpent flying through the sky that would jet in and out like a snake. They described it as a snake-like object with fins of silver and a head like a snake. They described that it flew around the town for a number of times. And so the farmers that saw it went and described it the next day to some townspeople. And the following night it was seen by about 100 people in the town. Now Fort Scott, Kansas is located not far from where I live in Oklahoma right now. So I made a little trip up there just to visit the town and see what it's like. It hasn't changed that much. It's still farming communities there. The next case is very interesting. Happened not too far from here by some men that were out hunting just north of Dallas. And what's interesting, this is the first recorded time that someone described a flying object as looking saucer-like. Now this happened not too far from here, and the man that described it said it approached at a very wonderful speed, and as he observed it, it hovered for a while and then zoomed off at the same speed. According to world-famous UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek, he studied this observation and he classified it as a daylight disk. And this is one of the first times that anyone actually recorded their observation of an object that looked saucer-like. Now this is one that I've experienced myself. People often ask me, have I seen any UFOs? No. I've had a lot of people that have seen UFOs and talked to us about them. But on many occasions I've been out to see the Marfa lights. And as a storyteller, there's many legends and stories that are told that describe the Marfa lights. But we're going to talk about a man that was out herding cattle in the 1880s. And as they were out herding their cattle, they saw these lights appear. They thought it were the lights of campfires from Apache Indians, so they went out to investigate. But they could find no evidence of any Indians or any campfires. That happened the second night, they did the same, and on the third night they did the same. They could find no evidence. Now, we stopped and did this filming of the Marfa lights ourselves. The state of Texas has put up a visiting center there and an observation rest stop. It's just kind of west, no, it's west of Marfa, right? Or it's east? East. It's east of Marfa, about 9 miles. And as you could see from the observation deck, you could see some lights appearing there that we filmed there by where we put the red bar. Now to the right, there's a telephone pole, and any lights that appear to the right of that could be headlights from cars, because there's a highway that goes from Marfa down to Presidio.
Okay, the blinking light where the red indicator is a tower.
Okay.
So anything other than that blinking light is unexplained.
Right, anything in between that telephone pole and the blinking tower would be unexplained lights. And we were able to film some. One time when we were there was a film crew from Amarillo that were there filming and interviewing people while we were there. And a friend of Noe's had some night vision goggles that he uses as a border patrolman, and we were able to put those on. Well, with the naked eye we saw dozens of lights, but when we put on those night vision goggles, all of a sudden we could see hundreds of lights that we couldn't see with the naked eye. Now, many people have tried to explain these. Sul Ross University, which is there in Alpine, has done studies, and they've come up with different theories of what's behind those lights, but nobody can really explain what causes them. Now, there's several legends and tales. One is about an Indian chief named Alsate that used to make raids into Mexico and steal and rustle cattle. Well, the Mexican government got tired of his raids and they hunted him down, and he was executed, and his tribe was spread across Mexico, sold into slavery. So some legends have that he is wandering the mountains where he used to spend a lot of time, and you could still see him coming down the mountains. One of my favorite stories that explains it is about Wicked John, who was not allowed, he was so mean he was not allowed to go to hell when he died. The devil wouldn't let him in. He wasn't allowed to go to heaven, so he didn't know what to do. So as he was leaving the gates of hell, some devils threw some fire over the fence at him. So he picked up the fire and he carried it with him, and he ended up in Texas. So they say you could see Wicked John wandering the mountainside each night carrying those great big balls of fire. So that's one of my favorite stories. And it's one of my favorite places to go. There it is. If you're going out to Big Bend or on your way to El Paso, you may want to stop one night and observe the lights. Now this story comes from Nebraska, and it was recorded in the paper, and it's also about some cowboys that were out herding cattle. They saw what they thought was a meteorite hurtling through the sky, and it crashed in a ravine not far from where they were. This is interesting because it's the first recorded history of someone being actually injured by a UFO. The cowboys rode over to the ravine to take a look, and one of the cowboys got up to the edge of the ravine and looked over, and about 200 yards away they saw this crashed object that was so bright they could barely look at it. Well, one of the cowboys, he was there a little bit too long, and his face was completely burned and covered with blisters, and they had to take him away and get medical help. And the object was so hot that they couldn't approach it. They described what they saw as giant cogwheels that were scattered all across the ground, and where the object had crashed, it had burned all the grass and melted the sand to form like melted glass, turn the sand into glass. So they waited about a day. They described it as a cylindrical shaped object, which looks like some of the early blimps of the time. Of course, at those days, they didn't have those kinds of aircraft. Well, they waited, went too far. They waited the next day for things to cool off. The people of the town went to observe it. Well, they had a big rainstorm. And as the people sat there watching it rain, the pieces of metal were washed away. And after the rain stopped, the newspaper describes the object as having melted away, that there was nothing remaining of it. Now, we'll go from Nebraska to one of my favorite parts of the country where all the redwood trees are. We'll go up to Humboldt County, where there was a man that was a cattleman there, and he was out one day and he noticed some of the local tribesmen, and one of the local tribesmen was carrying a big platter of meat, and he was walking towards the forest. So he followed him, and as he followed him, they discovered that he went to a cave where sat a tall, hairy, human-like creature sat cross-legged on the ground in the cave, where this Native American began to feed him meat. And as frightened, as scary looking as this creature was, he seemed to be very peaceful and very calm. So he went back several times to visit, each time when the man took the meat to this creature, and he asked him about it, but they wouldn't tell him anything about it. So finally, after trading a lot of possessions that he had to this local tribesman, he was able to get the story of how they found this creature. And according to the local tribesmen, these crazy bears, that they called them, came down in small moons from a ship in the sky. And when they would land, the Indians would round them up and take care of them. And he told them that this had happened several times, and that on board this ship they met some humans that looked, pretty much like we do, except they described them as having very short hair and wearing tight silver clothing. So this is a story of how the crazy bears came to the Redwood area of California. Next, we'll go to the Tombstone area. And this, I guess you wouldn't call it a UFO. It might be an unidentified prehistoric object. But some cowboys were out, again, herding cattle, when a huge flying beast they described as a flying crocodile approached them and landed not far away. So, frightening their horses, they began to shoot at it, but they said it did no avail of shooting at this giant creature. They said the wingspan measured about 160 feet is what they described. After shooting at it several times, they were able to kill the beast, and they found that its wings were made of some light leather type substance, which they cut pieces off and took into town. Okay, now later, there were supposedly pictures of them taken with this beast, but that the pictures disappeared. And the news article appeared in several local papers. And later, about 40 years later, they finally found a witness that described what had happened, but they said that the newspaper greatly exaggerated the size of the beast. It was really only about 32 feet from wing to wing, and not 160 feet. Also, the sightings of these happened in San Diego around the same time. So did this beast, did it fly from San Diego to Arizona? And the men that they interviewed later said they were unable to kill the beast and that it flew off to the west. So maybe it flew from Arizona to San Diego. Okay, next is another UFO that landed not far from here in Stevensville. This happened, Dublin. Yeah, it's near Stevensville, where other UFO sightings in modern times have been recorded. But this happened over a cotton gin, and the people looked up and they saw this bright light in the sky, and then they heard this loud explosion, and then pieces of metal came flying out of the sky and landed on the ground. The people were so afraid they ran into their houses and hid until the next day. Then they went out to see what it might have been that exploded over their town. The next day, as they went out, they found small pieces of metal and debris, and what was interesting, they found pieces of paper on which a language was written that nobody in the town could decipher. And they picked up all these pieces of paper that were scattered all over the area. And if you go to the town today, they preserve the cotton gin and the cabin, and they're in the process of making like a small visitor center there where this supposedly took place. It was published in both the Denton and the Dallas papers at that time. From there, we'll go to Indiana. Okay, Crawfordsville is a small town in central Indiana, and again, we find this flying serpent-like object that was seen during the nighttime this time. This flying creature was described with hundreds of fins and one great big flaming eye. and it seemed to circle the town and undulate like a snake as it was flying. Now, many people have said, well, maybe this was a giant flock of birds flying south for the winter, but I think most of you would know, if you were a farmer in those days and you were outside almost every day, you might know the difference between a flock of birds and a flying serpent with a great glowing red eye flying through the sky. So in these old newspaper accounts, we have descriptions of cylindrical objects, saucer-shaped objects, serpent-shaped objects that were flying through the sky, how they described them. So we're getting descriptions of things that are not always the same. Okay? And this is kind of a drawing of what the people described that they saw at night. Now, in Oklahoma, I've seen many large flocks of birds that fly and make lots of noise, and they do kind of undulate through the sky. Some of them I've seen are maybe a mile long, flocks of birds as they travel. But I don't know if I would mistake it for a flying serpent with a glowing eye. Now we'll go back to the great Northwest, where a group of men were out on a hunting and fishing trip up around Tacoma, Washington in 1893. They had been out aboard a ship fishing, and then they had docked their ship and gone ashore and pitched their tents for the night. And they began hearing a very eerie whooshing sound, and the hair on their heads began to stand up with electric pins and needles all throughout their body they could feel. So they got up thinking a thunderstorm was approaching. When they looked in the sky, there was nothing there. But they looked over for where they heard the sound, and they noticed a glow, a bright light approaching them on the water. Okay, and this happened up near the Puget Sound, in the beautiful parts of the state of Washington. And as they looked, they described this object swimming towards them as a giant serpent-like creature that had a head like a walrus with 8 eyes the size of dinner plates and antlers from which glowing red and blue flames shot out. And they also described that about every 8 feet on this beast that they saw seemed to be a ring of copper from which they believed the electricity was emitting. So one of the men decided to run up closer and get a closer look, and as he did, steam and electricity shot out from the antlers and knocked him out onto the beach. His friend tried to approach and save him, and the same thing happened to him. So the other men ran back into the woods to hide, and fortunately for them, this beast that they described turned around, went back into the water, and as it swam away, they could see the glow and lights of it from beneath the surface of the water. Now, it was not too long before that when Jules Verne published his book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which described a beast that the sailors thought was a giant sea serpent that would attack whaling ships and slave ships along the coast. And did these guys, had they read stories of Jules Verne's and described the creature like the Nautilus? Or were they describing, something else? It appeared to be alive, and it appeared to be able to propel itself through the water by its tail. And lastly, I think we'll talk about alien cattle rustlers. Now, I just read where along the Oklahoma-Texas border, the ice cream company Brahms just lost, I think it was like 480 head of cattle. When they did their inventory, they were missing. Okay, so nobody likes to miss that many cattle. And of course, they asked the company if they branded their cattle, and they said no. So I think they'll start branding their cattle. But in these days, some farmers described they went out and heard this loud noise in their their barn in commotion with their cattle, and as they went out, they saw the cylindrical-shaped airship with a carriage underneath. Inside, they described that they saw 3 of the strangest human-like people on board, and it had roped a calf and was trying to lift it up into the spacecraft. So they grabbed their axes and ran after it, tried to cut loose the cow, but they couldn't, and the spaceship disappeared, towing the cow behind it. Later, the next day, one of the farmers said that they found the mutilated body of the cow in his pasture not far away. And then at about the same time, there were stories of the same thing in Indiana, where people were finding cattle dead on the ground with all the blood sucked out of them. So did aliens come in the 1800s and steal cattle just to suck their blood? Maybe they were alien vampires. We don't know. Now, these stories are all recorded in the newspapers of the time, and a lot of them, they get affidavits from their neighbors that swear that the people who tell these stories are not crazy and that they must be believed as true. But in this particular case, it was later discovered that the man telling this story belonged to the local Liars Club. And he invented this tall tale to try to outdo other members of his club that also would tell tall tales of strange things that happened around their town. Well, is this the end? Well, if you read Noe's book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, you'll find other stories taken from newspaper accounts of small towns across the United States that list some very strange and unusual things that people saw during those days. Nowadays, more and more newspapers are archiving their past issues, and so those are available now to be able to search through and find more stories like this. As newspaper and magazine subscriptions go down with the internet and things like that, they're having to find new ways to sell their papers. So many companies are going back to their older editions and digitizing them and making them available for people to search, not only for stories like these, but stories about your ancestors, where you could find birth, marriage, and death records in the small towns where maybe your ancestors lived in the early part of the United States history. So these are just some of the stories that are included in this book. And if you want to read more, you can go to roswellbooks.com and order that. We sold all copies of the books we had with us today.
Let's give him a big applause. Stephen Andrasko. We're going to take a break, and then at 2:30 we're going to have somebody I'm vaguely familiar with, Noe something or other. We'll be here talking about one of the most amazing UFO cases I've ever heard of that happened not too far from here. We'll be back at 2:30.